There are men who measure their worth in fence posts and cattle and the size of the moon over their land. I used to think Calhoun Ray's was one of them. I worked his ranch 11 years, and I'd have told you I knew the shape of the man down to the grain, the way you know a saddle you've ridden into shapelessness. Then one cold night a woman came up the wagon road with nothing but a wet shawl and a child she wasn't carrying anymore, and she told him she'd be gone by morning. And I watched a man I thought I'd memorized say 4 words back to her, that I have turned over in my hands for 30 years and still cannot set down. I'm an old man now. My hands shake when I write this, which is its own small joke because I never learned to do anything with these hands but rope and ride and dig. But somebody ought to put it down before I'm gone too. So here. This is the truth of it as near as I can carry it. The dogs went off first. That's how I knew before I knew anything. I was in the bunkhouse with my boots half on, listening to Tobe Whitford snore like a sawmill in the next cot, and the dogs out in the yard set up that low warning that isn't quite a bark, more a question they're asking the dark. I'd been on the raised spread long enough to read those dogs better than I read most people. A coyote got one kind of noise. A rider got another. This was the third kind, the one they saved for something they couldn't name. I am, I should say, a man who keeps a log, always have. Little leather book, pencil stub I keep sharp with my knife. Whether calving what we spent, what we lost. My mother could read and she taught me, and I have never trusted my own memory the way I trust a thing written down. So I can tell you it was the second week of November, 1889, because I wrote it that night by lamplight when my hand wouldn't be still, and the entry begins, woman come up the road. Don't know yet. That's all I had the words for at the time. I pulled my boots the rest of the way on and went out. The cold that high up gets into you sideways. It doesn't announce itself like heat does. It just finds the seams in you and settles in, and by the time you notice, you're already shaking. I came around the corner of the bunkhouse and there, she was at the edge of the lamplight from the main house window, a woman, on foot, swaying like a sapling that's been bent too long and forgotten how to straighten. Her shawl was soaked through. Her hair was down and dark and stuck to the side of her face, and she had her arms crossed over her chest the way a person does when they're holding something that isn't there anymore. The dogs had circled her, but they weren't snarling. They'd dropped their hackles. Even the dogs could tell. Easy, I said, more to them than to her. Easy now. She turned her head and looked at me, and I have seen a lot of faces over a lot of years, and most of them I have forgotten, but I will tell you I never forgot hers. Not because it was beautiful, though I suppose it was, underneath. It was the eyes. They had gone past fear into something quieter and worse. The look of a person who has already decided how a thing is going to end and is only walking the last of the road to get there. I need to speak to the man who owns this land, she said. Her voice was steady. That surprised me, considering the rest of her was coming apart. That be Mr. Ray's, I said. He's abed most likely, it's late. Wake him. I'd like to say I bristled at being given an order by a stranger on the road in the dead of night. I didn't. There was something in the way she said it that made the request feel like the last coin she had to spend. You don't begrudge a person their last coin. But I didn't have to wake him. The lamp in the main house was already moving. I could see the light slide across the window glass. And then the door opened, and Calhoun Ray stood in it with a shotgun broke over his arm and his nightshirt tucked into his trousers and his gray hair standing up every which way. He was a big man, Ray's. Not tall so much as wide and solid, built like the country he came from, which was somewhere south he never talked about much. His father had been Mexican and his mother Anglo, or the other way around. I never got the straight of it and never asked, because on that ranch, a man's history was his own affair unless he chose to make a gift of it. He'd built the place up from a played-out homestead claim, and he'd buried a wife on the rise behind the barn, and he'd raised one boy who'd gone to Denver and didn't write. That was the whole of what I knew about Calhoun Ray's after 11 years. It tells you something about a man, what you don't know after 11 years. He took in the woman, the dogs, the dark beyond her, the wet road. He clicked the shotgun closed, but he pointed it at the ground. "Who's coming behind you?" he said. It was the right first question. She'd come up the road from town, 12 miles on foot in November, soaked. A woman doesn't do that for no reason. A woman does that because something is at her back. "No one yet," she said. "There will be, by morning, maybe sooner." Reyes nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed a thing he'd already supposed. Then he stepped back from the door and held it open. "Come in out of the cold," he said. "You can tell it's sitting down." Her name was Adelina. She didn't give a last name, and Reyes didn't ask for one, and I have come to think that was a kindness, because a last name is a thing you can be hunted by. I built up the stove while Reyes fetched a blanket, and I put coffee on, and the whole time she sat at the kitchen table with her wet shawl still around her shoulders and her hands flat on the wood like she was making sure the table was real. She wouldn't take the blanket at first. Reyes had to set it down beside her and walk away from it before she'd touch it, like a thing you offer a half-wild animal. When she finally drew it up around herself, she did it in one quick motion and then went still again, ashamed, maybe, of having wanted it. "I should tell you about the child, because the child is the heart of all of it, and I have been circling it the way you circle a thing too hot to grab." She'd had a daughter. The girl was 4. Her name was, she said it once and her voice did a thing on it, broke and caught and went on, her name was Paloma. The husband was the trouble. I won't give him a name because he doesn't deserve to be remembered by one. He was a drinking man and a hitting man, and he had moved them out from Kansas chasing work that never quite came, and the work not coming had made the drinking worse and the hitting worse, the way it does. She told it flat. No tears by then. She'd cried herself dry somewhere back on that 12 miles of road, and what was left was just the telling. 3 nights before, he'd come home wrong, worse than usual. She'd put Paloma to bed in the loft of the rented room they had above the feed store, and she'd tried to keep quiet, keep small, the way you learn to. And he'd wanted to know where his money was, the money she'd been hiding out of the housekeeping in a coffee tin. $2.40 she'd squirreled away over 4 months because she had a plan, she said. She'd had a plan to take Paloma and run. He found the tin. "I'm going to leave a space here, the way she left a space in the telling. Some things a man shouldn't write down even when he's setting down to tell the truth. There are kinds of truth that are also wounds, and you don't go opening another person's wound just to prove you saw it. I'll say only this. By the time she ran alone, and she'd been walking these 3 days, sleeping in barns and ditches, working her way toward, she didn't even rightly know toward what. Away. That was the only direction she had left in her. Away. And the husband was behind her. Because a man like that, when his pride's been cut, he doesn't let a thing go. He'd been asking in town. Somebody had told him a woman matching her went up the North Road. The Reyes Road. "So you see," she said, and she pulled the blanket tighter, "I can't stay. I'll be gone by morning. I only needed," and here her steadiness cracked, "just a hairline, just for a second. I only needed a roof for the dark part of the night. The middle part. When it's worst. I'll be gone before light. I won't bring it down on you. I swear it." She said I'll be gone by morning like a thing she'd practiced. Like a thing she'd promised herself, she would say so that no one could accuse her later of asking for more than she had a right to. She had walked herself down to almost nothing, and even out of that almost nothing, she was trying to take up as little room in the world as she could. I looked at Reyes. He'd been standing by the stove the whole while with his arms crossed, and his face doing nothing I could read. He had a way of going still and far off when he was thinking, and you learned not to crowd it. The coffee had gone past ready. The pot ticked and hissed. Out in the yard, one of the dogs gave a single low woof at nothing, and we all 3 of us flinched, even Reyes, and then the silence came back down. And Reyes said his 4 words. He said, "You'll stay till spring." That's it, that's the whole of it. 4 words, "You'll stay till spring." You have to understand what those words cost, what they meant, for them to land the way they landed. because Ray's wasn't a soft man. I'd seen him turn off a hand for stealing not because of the worth of the thing. It was a length of rope, I think, hardly anything, but because the man had lied about it after. I'd seen him refuse a Bible salesman a bed in a blizzard, not out of meanness, but because the fellow had been disrespectful to the dogs, and Ray's held that against a person more than most things. He gave nothing away. Not because he had nothing to give, but because he'd learned somewhere sometime, in that history he never spoke of, that giving things away was how you got hurt. And here was the most dangerous thing a man could take in. A woman with a violent man behind her. A man who would come, who was maybe already coming, who would have the law on his side too, because the law in those days held that a wife was a man's property near as much as a horse was, and the law would not look kindly on a stranger keeping another man's wife on his land. Ray's wasn't just offering her a roof. He was putting his whole self, his land, his name, the thing he'd built up from a played-out claim with his own 2 hands between this woman and the thing chasing her. Till spring. Not till morning. Not till the worst of the night passed. Till the snow broke and the roads cleared and she had a real chance at a real distance. She didn't understand it at first. I watched her not understand it. She started to say something, no, I think, the start of no, I couldn't, the reflex of a person who has been taught that nothing comes free, and a thing offered freely is a thing with a hook in it. And then she did understand it. I watched that too. I watched it go into her the way the cold goes into you, sideways, finding the seams. Her mouth was open on the word she'd meant to say, and the word never came. Her eyes filled but didn't spill. She looked at this big, gray-headed stranger in a tucked-in nightshirt who had no reason in the world to do this thing, and she could not make a single sound. That's the part the story keeps in its title, I suppose, if anybody ever did tell it as a story. The rancher's response left her speechless. Like it was a clever thing he said. It wasn't clever. It was just true, and it was just enormous, and there are some true, enormous things that take the breath clean out of a person. But here is what they don't put in the title, what nobody who turns a thing like this into a tidy tale ever wants to say. Ray's was afraid. I knew him. I saw it. His jaw was set too hard. He'd offered her the world in 4 words, and then he'd had to cross the kitchen and pour the coffee just to have something to do with his hands, and his hands weren't steady either. He didn't know if he could keep the promise. He'd made it anyway. That's not the same as being unafraid. I have come to believe, in my old age, that it is a great deal better than being unafraid. Anybody can be brave when they don't understand the size of the thing. To see the whole size of it and say you'll stay till spring anyway, that's a different animal. We made her up a bed in the room that had been the boys', the one in Denver who didn't write. Ray's hadn't let anybody sleep in there the whole 11 years I'd known him. I'd assumed it was grief, and maybe it was, but that night he opened the door to it without a flicker, like the room had been waiting for exactly this, and he'd known it would come. She stopped in the doorway. There was a small carved horse on the windowsill, the kind a father whittles for a boy. She looked at it. "I can't take a child's room," she said. "It's nobody's room now," Ray said. "Might as well be somebody's." I went back out to the bunkhouse before the rest of it, so I don't know what they said, if they said anything. Tobe was awake by then, sitting up in the dark, and he asked me what the commotion was, and I told him a woman had come up the road and was staying till spring, and Tobe was quiet a minute, and then he said, "Ray's know what he's letting in the door." And I said, "Ray's knows better than any of us." And Tobe lay back down, and after a while he said, "Into the dark. Then God help all of us." And he wasn't wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either, and the difference between those two is the rest of this story. I lay awake a long time. The wind came up and pushed at the bunkhouse walls. I thought about the husband out there somewhere in the cold, coming. I thought about the $2.40 in a coffee tin, 4 months of a woman's small private hope, and a man's fist closing over it. I thought about the carved horse on the windowsill and the boy in Denver, and the wife on the rise behind the barn, and how a man can build a whole life that is mostly made of the places where other people used to be. And I thought about those 4 words and how Ray's had said them, not loud, not soft, just flat and certain, like reading off the weather. You'll stay till spring. Like it was already true. Like the saying of it made it true. I took out my logbook and I wrote by the last of the lamp. Woman name of Adelina, husband coming. R says she stays till spring. God knows how. And under it, because I am a man who likes a thing to balance, who likes the columns to add up, I wrote the only honest tally I could make of that night. I wrote, don't know what we just took on. Know it was right, both true. He came 4 days later. I want to tell that part properly, because it's the part where everything that was promised in the kitchen got tested against the cold, hard world that doesn't care what we promise. But you have to know the 4 days first. The 4 days where a strange new shape settled over the ranch, where a woman who flinched at sudden movements slowly stopped flinching, where she found the henhouse on her on the second morning and had eggs going before any of us were up, not because anyone asked, but because being useful was the only language she had left for thank you. You have to know about the way she stood at the edge of things watching the horizon, the road, always the road, like a woman watching a fuse burn. You have to know that Ray's took to cleaning his guns in the kitchen those 4 days where she could see him do it, not as a threat, never that, but as a kind of telling. A way of saying, without the embarrassment of saying it, I meant it. I'm ready for what comes. You can stop watching the road now. She didn't stop watching the road, but she watched it a little easier, knowing he was watching it too. And then on the 4th day, late, with the light going copper over the western fence line, one of the dogs set up that third kind of noise again, the one they save for something they can't name, and we all came out into the yard, and there at the bottom of the wagon road, dismounting from a horse he'd run too hard, was a man with a pistol on his hip and a look on his face that I had seen before on men who have decided that another person belongs to them. Adelina made a sound I won't try to spell. And Calhoun Ray's stepped down off the porch and out into the yard, slow, between her and the road, the way you'd step between a child and a snake. And he didn't have his shotgun. He had nothing in his hands at all. And I remember thinking, what in God's name is he doing? And I started for the bunkhouse where my rifle was. I never made it to the rifle. What happened next is the second part of this, and it is the part I have spent 30 years trying to understand. And I am only now, with my shaking hand and my sharp pencil, ready to set it down. But not tonight. Even an old man knows when he's said enough for one sitting. The hard part keeps till the next lamp. I have started this part of the telling 4 times now, and 4 times I have set down the pencil, because the trouble with the truth is that it doesn't go the way a story wants to go. A story wants the bad man to come up the road and the good man to face him down and one of them to be standing at the end of it. That's clean. That's what you'd pay a nickel for at the picture show, if they'd had picture shows then, which they didn't, but you take my meaning. What actually happened was slower and stranger and harder to hold, and I'm going to try to tell it true, even where true makes a poor story. So, the husband at the bottom of the wagon road, with his horse blown and his pistol on his hip. And Ray's walking out into the yard with empty hands. I'll tell you the first thing I noticed, because it has stayed with me longer than the rest. The man was younger than I'd built him up to be in my mind. Across 4 days I'd made a monster out of him, given him size, given him years, given him the face of every cruel thing I'd ever run across. And here came a fellow maybe 30, narrow through the shoulders, with a thin sandy mustache he probably thought made him look older than he was. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a clerk who'd gotten hold of a gun. That was worse, somehow. It's easy to understand a monster. It's the ordinary ones that keep you up at night, because you realize how thin the wall is between them and the rest of us. He stood by his horse and he looked up at the house, at the barn, at the dogs ringed around him at a careful distance, at Ray's coming across the yard, at me half froze on the bunkhouse step, at Tobe behind me, and here his whole body changed at Adelina up on the porch, gone white as the underside of a leaf. "There you are," he said to her, not loud. He said it almost gentle, almost glad, and that gentleness was the most frightening thing in the whole encounter, frightening in a way the gun on his hip was not. "I've been worried sick. You had me thinking the worst." She didn't say anything. Her hand had found the porch post and was holding it the way she'd held the kitchen table that first night, checking that it was real. "Come on now," he said. "Get your things. We'll square up with these people for their trouble and we'll go home." And here is the part. Here is the part I have turned over 30 years. I thought Ray's would say something hard. I thought there'd be a line drawn, a "she's not going anywhere," something with a fence in it. That's what I'd have done, God help me. That's what was already half formed and hot in my own chest. But Ray's didn't draw a line. Ray's stopped maybe 10 feet from the man, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to seem afraid, and he took his hat off. He took his hat off. To the man who'd done what that man had done. I didn't understand it. I near hated him for it in the moment. "Evening," Ray said. "You'll have come a hard ride. Get your horse some water before he founders on you. There's a trough by the barn." And then, without any change in his voice, in the exact same flat, certain tone he'd used in the kitchen 4 nights before, "She's staying here." The man laughed. It was a small, ugly laugh, the laugh of a person who's never once in his life been told no by anyone smaller than him and has come to believe that means no exists. "She's my wife," he said. "I expect that's so," Ray said. "Then there's no staying here about it. There's law, mister, you know there's law." "There's law," Ray's agreed. "You'd put yourself crosswise of it. For her, you don't even know her." The man's hand drifted, not fast, not a draw, just a drift, the way a man rests his palm on a thing he wants you to remember is there. "The pistol. I'm trying to be reasonable. I rode all this way to be reasonable. Don't make me be the other thing. Now, I have to stop here and tell you something about Calhoun Ray's that I didn't tell you in the first part, because I didn't understand its weight yet myself when I started this. The history he never spoke of. The wife buried on the rise. The boy in Denver who didn't write. I learned the shape of it later, some that night, some over the years. Some I pieced together the way you piece together a thing from the holes other people leave around it. Ray's first life, the one before the played-out homestead claim, the one south of here he never named. He'd had a sister. And the man his sister married had been an ordinary narrow-shouldered fellow with a gentle voice. And one day that ordinary fellow had killed her, and the law in that place had looked at it and called it a private matter between a man and his wife, and done not one single thing. And young Calhoun Ray's, who had been somewhere else, who had been off being young and not paying attention the way the young aren't, had come back to a grave and a closed door and a law that shrugged. That's why he didn't draw a line in the yard. He'd seen what came of lines drawn in anger. He knew the gentle-voiced ones, knew them down in the marrow. He knew this wasn't a thing you won by being bigger or louder or faster to the gun. He'd learned in the hardest school there is that the only thing that beats that kind of man is patience that will not break, a wall so plain and so immovable that the man wears himself out against it. You don't fight the gentle-voiced ones. You outlast them. You make yourself into the one fixed thing in a world they've spent their whole life learning to bend. "I'm not making you anything," Ray said. "I'm telling you a true thing and you can do with it what you like. She's staying here till spring. You can ride into town and fetch the marshal, and he can ride out, and we'll all of us stand in this yard and have it out lawful, and I'll say my piece and you'll say yours and she'll say hers." He let that sit a half-second. "She'll say hers." And I saw the man's jaw tighten, because the last thing on God's earth that man wanted was a Delina saying hers to a marshal. Or you can water your horse and ride home and let the winter pass and think on what kind of man you want to be when the road's clear. But she's staying here. That part's already settled. That part was settled before you came up the road. The man's eyes went to the bunkhouse where I stood and to Tobe behind me and counted us. He counted the dogs. He looked at the barn where, for all he knew, 3 more hands might be waiting with 3 more rifles. He was a coward, the way the gentle-voiced ones nearly always are underneath, brave only with a woman in a locked room and no one watching. Out here in the open with witnesses and the light going and a big still man with his hat in his hands refusing to give him the fight he'd ridden out for, he didn't know what to do. There was no bending this. He'd come to break something and there was nothing to break. "This isn't over," he said, which is what they say, the small men, when it's over. "You hear me? This isn't over." "No," Ray said almost kindly. "I don't expect it is." And the man got on his blown horse and turned it and rode back down the wagon road into the dusk. And we all stood there and watched the dark take him. And nobody said a word until the sound of the hooves had gone all the way out of hearing. Then Adelina sat down. Just sat, right there on the porch boards, knees gone out from under her, and put her face in her hands. And the sound she made then was not the held-in sound from the first night. It came all the way out of her. 4 days of held-in everything, and a husband's gentle voice in the yard, and then the dark taking him without her in it. She wept like something coming loose at the root. Rays went up the steps and crouched down beside her, not touching. He never touched her. The whole time she was with us I never once saw him touch her. He was careful as a man can be. And he just crouched there at arm's length and waited it out, his hat still in his hands, until she was done. That's the confrontation. That's the whole of it. No shots. No blood. A man took his hat off and said a true thing and outlasted another man's cruelty by simply refusing to meet it on its own ground. I told you it made a poor story, but I have come to think it's the truest thing I ever saw a man do, and the bravest, and I have seen men do brave things with guns in their hands and they don't hold a candle to it. I'd like to tell you that was the end of the trouble. It wasn't. It was barely the start, because the gentle-voiced ones don't ride home and think on what kind of man they want to be. They ride into town and they start talking. What he did was clever and it nearly worked, and I'll give the devil that. He didn't go to the marshal, he couldn't, not without risking Adelina saying her piece. Instead, he went to the town. He sat in the saloon, and he was a wronged husband, wasn't he? A poor abandoned fellow whose wife had run off and shacked up with a stranger out the North Road. And didn't that just figure, that foreigner Rays, that half-Mexican who kept to himself and looked down his nose at honest folk? Of course a man like that would take in another man's wife. No respect for how things are done. And on, a little more poison in every glass. And the thing about a town is that a town is mostly bored. And a town mostly loves a reason to feel righteous. And a town had never much cared for Calhoun Rays anyhow, because he didn't drink with them and didn't go to their church, and had the wrong color in his skin, and too much money in his bank, and not enough need of any of them. The husband knew exactly which strings to pull. By the time a week was out, the talk had hardened into a thing with weight to it. The feed store wouldn't extend our credit. The man who'd been going to buy our fall steers found a reason he no longer could. A note got nailed to the church door. I never saw it, Tobe did, and Tobe wouldn't tell me what it said, which told me enough. I watched it close around us like weather, and I watched Rays hold steady through it the same way he'd held steady in the yard, not because it didn't touch him, but because he decided the steadiness was the whole of the fight. He paid cash where credit failed. He drove the steers 2 days farther to a buyer who didn't know the talk yet. He took the losses the way you take a beating you've decided to take, and he never once let Adelina see the size of what it was costing him. But she saw. Of course she saw. She wasn't a fool, and a woman who's spent years learning to read the weather of one dangerous man can read the weather of a whole town easy enough. She saw the credit dry up and the steers go cheap, and the way the hands got quiet when they thought she'd come into the room. And one morning in early December, I found her in the barn before light with her shawl on dry now. She'd had a dry shawl for weeks, and her few things bundled, and she was saddling the gentlest of the horses with hands that knew what they were doing, and I knew exactly what I was looking at. "He's losing everything," she said before I could say anything. She didn't turn around. "Because of me, the town, the money, he won't say it, but I see it. I won't be the thing that takes a good man's whole life from him. I told him I'd be gone by morning. He's the one who changed it to spring. But the first promise was mine and I get to keep it. She cinched the strap. "I'll be gone before he's up." There it was again. "I'll be gone by morning. Come all the way back around." The same 4 words she'd walked up the road with, and she meant them now the way she'd meant them then, as the smallest space a person could take up in the world, as a way of giving back the one thing she had to give, which was her absence. And I stood there in the cold, dark barn, an old hand who keeps a log book and isn't much for speeches, and I didn't know what to say to stop her, and I wasn't even sure I had the right to. Maybe she was correct. Maybe leaving was the loving thing. Maybe the kindest gift she could give Ray's was to not make him keep a promise that was sinking him. I didn't get to decide, because Ray's was already standing in the barn door. He'd come down before light himself. He always did. The man never slept past 4 in his life, and he'd heard her, or enough of her, and he stood there in the gray with the cold coming off him in a cloud, and his face was doing the still far-off thing, the thinking thing. She heard him and went rigid. Caught. Like the first night, all over again. The horse stamped. One of the barn cats threaded between my boots, and I remember the absurd, ordinary warmth of it against my ankle while the whole world hung waiting. "You're going to ride out," Ray said, "not a question." "I have to," she said. "You know I have to. Look what it's costing you." And Ray's was quiet a long moment, the longest moment, and I thought he might let her go. I thought maybe even Ray's had a limit, and the town had finally found it. And then he said the thing that is the true center of this whole telling, the thing that even now, with my hand shaking and my pencil sharp, I can barely get down without having to stop. He said, "But the light's going and my hand's gone bad, and there's a kind of thing you don't rush." What Ray said in that barn, and what it cost him to mean it, and how it all came out in the end, the spring, and the roads clearing, and what became of Adelina, and the one last visit from the man down the wagon road, that's the last of it. That's the part I've been afraid to write for 30 years, because once I write it down it's finished, and as long as it's not finished some part of all of them is still standing in that gray barn with the breath clouding, and the whole rest of their lives not yet decided. But it keeps till the last lamp. Everything keeps till the last lamp, until the night it doesn't. I've put it off as long as a man can put a thing off. My daughter, for I had a daughter later, a whole life later, though that's another telling, she came by this morning and found me with the pencil in my hand and the page still empty, and she said, "Pa, you've been at that same page a week." And I said it was a hard page. And she said they're all hard, that's why they're worth writing, which is the kind of thing she got from her mother and not from me, and she put the coffee on and left me to it. So, the barn. The gray light. Ray's in the doorway with the cold coming off him, and Adelina with her bundle and the saddled horse, and the thing he said. He said, "You didn't ask me for spring, I gave you spring. There's a difference and it matters, so hear it." She stood there holding the cinch strap. "You think you're costing me," Ray's went on, and his voice did something it didn't usually do. It got rough at the edges, like a board that's been left out in the weather. "The town, the credit, the steers. You think you've done the addition and you come out as the thing that's taking from me. You've got the arithmetic backwards. You've had it backwards since you came up the road thinking you had to make yourself small enough to slip in under a roof and out before light." He came a few steps into the barn. The horse swung its head to watch him. He stopped at a careful distance, always that careful distance. "I had a sister," he said. And he told her. Standing in the cold barn with the cats and the breath clouds, and an old hired man pretending hard to be busy with a length of harness in the corner, Calhoun Ray's told this stranger the thing he'd never told me in 11 years, the thing I only ever got the edges of from other people. He told her about the gentle-voiced man his sister married. He told her about being young and away and not paying attention. He told her about the grave he came home to, and the door that wouldn't open, and the law that called it a private matter and folded its hands. He told it plain, no heat in it, the way you tell a thing you've carried so long it's gone smooth, a stone in the pocket worn round by handling. "I have been able to do nothing about that for 30 years, he said. Not one thing. You can't fight a thing that's already happened. I've turned it over every way a man can turn a thing, and there's no door in it. It's done. She's gone, and the man that did it died fat and old in his bed, and the world said it was a private matter. He stopped. The horse stamped. And then you came up my road, with a man behind you, and the same private matter coming for you. And for the first time in 30 years, there was a door. He looked at her, and I have never before or since seen so much in a man's face. "You're not costing me anything," Reyes said. "You're the first thing in 30 years that's let me do something. So don't you take that from me at 4 in the morning with a borrowed horse and a head full of bad arithmetic. You stay till spring. Not for you. For her. For the one I couldn't. And when spring comes, you ride out free and whole, and you go live the rest of your life. And every year you're alive and far from that man is a year I get to put against the one I lost. That's the trade. That's the only trade I ever wanted. You staying is the gift to me. Your leaving now would be the taking." And Adelina, who had been left speechless once before, that first night, by 4 words in a warm kitchen, was left speechless a second time by these in a cold barn. But it was a different kind of speechless. The first time she couldn't speak because she couldn't believe a stranger would give her so much. This time she couldn't speak because she finally understood she wasn't taking. She'd spent her whole grown life being told, with fists and with silence, that she was a cost, a burden, a mouth and a body and a thing that took up room a man would rather have. And here was a man telling her, true and rough and certain, that her simply being alive in the world was the most useful thing she could possibly do, that her life had a weight that could be set against a 30-year grief and balance it. She put the bundle down. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She unsaddled the horse and rubbed it down and turned it back into its stall, and she walked past Reyes and past me into the gray morning toward the house, toward the hen house, toward the eggs she'd have going before the rest of us were up. And that was her answer. I wrote in my log that morning when my hand had quit shaking enough. She stays. R told her about the sister. I should not have heard it, but I'm glad I did. There are men who give you things. R gives you back to yourself. I'm not a man given to fine sentences, and I have never written a finer one, and I never will, and I didn't even rightly understand it when I wrote it. I understand it now. The winter was the winter. I won't pretend it turned soft just because something true had been said in a barn. The town stayed poisoned a good while. We ate down our stores and we made do, and there were lean weeks, and one of the dogs died, the old one, just of age, and we buried her near the rise, and I think that hit Adelina harder than it should have a dog she'd known 3 months, until I understood she wasn't grieving the dog. She was grieving everything she'd lost permission to grieve until she got somewhere safe enough to do it. Safety is a strange thing. It doesn't make the grief go away. It just finally lets it out. She changed across that winter. Slow, the way real change comes, not like in a story. The flinch went out of her by inches. There came a day in January she laughed at something Tobe said, Tobe of all people, who isn't funny on purpose more than once a year. And the sound of it surprised her so bad she clapped her hand over her mouth like she'd let out a swear in church. And Tobe and I both looked away quick to spare her the embarrassment of being caught at joy. There came a day she argued with Reyes about how to brine a ham and won and stood her ground the whole way and didn't once check his hands or his face for the weather. There came a day she sang, just a little, in the kitchen, some old song from the Kansas before everything. She didn't know I heard her. I never told her. That's the part nobody puts in the title. The rancher's response left her speechless. They'd make it about the one big moment, the kitchen or the barn. But the truth of it was the long, slow, ordinary winter where a frightened woman became an unfrightened one, a single thawed inch at a time, over brined hams and dead dogs and stolen songs, in a house with a man who never touched her and never raised his voice and never once made her pay for the room she took up. The big moments are what people remember. The small ones are what actually save a person. He came back the once, the husband, as they do. It was March, the worst of March, when the snow goes to gray slush and the world looks like it's given up. He came up the wagon road on foot, no horse this time, and even from the porch you could see the winter had not been kind to him. The town's love is a fickle thing. They'll buy a wronged husband's drinks for a month and then they get bored of him and start to wonder why, if he's so wronged, he's still here drinking instead of doing something about it. And the same poison he'd poured into the town's ear had curdled and come back on him. He'd lost whatever work he'd had. He had the look of a man who'd been sleeping rough and eating worse. The gentle voice was about all he had left. I went for the rifle. I'll own it. 3 months of watching Adelina come back to life had put something in me that wanted, badly, to keep the world that did it to her away from this door. But Ray's caught my eye across the yard and shook his head, once slow, and I left the rifle where it was. Same as the first time. The man had never learned anything from being a wall, and I had by then. Adelina came out on the porch. She didn't hide. That was the difference winter had made. 3 months before she'd have been white and frozen, and now she came out and stood square and looked down the road at the man who'd owned her, and her face was not afraid. It was something harder to name. It was almost sorrow. The sorrow you feel for a thing you once feared when you finally see how small it was all along. "Lena," he said, the gentle voice. "Lena, I've had a hard winter. I've thought about everything. I've changed, Lena. I swear to God I've." "No," she said. Just the one word. She'd had a whole winter to find it. She'd had a hard man tell her she was worth more than the room she took up, and she'd had a long cold season to believe it. And now she had the one word she'd never been able to say in a locked room above a feed store, and she stood on a porch in the slush and she said it out loud to his face. No, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the most finished word I ever heard. He looked at her and at Ray's and at me on the bunkhouse step and at Tobe and at the dogs and at the wall of it all, and something went out of him. Whatever he'd ridden, walked all that way to do, he couldn't do it. There was nothing to break. There was just a woman who wasn't his anymore, on land that wasn't his, behind a wall he couldn't get over or under or through, and the law that he'd thought was on his side wasn't going to walk up that road and hand her back to him, because the law, as it turned out, mostly only helps the ones who can pay it, and he'd drunk away his money and his welcome both. I don't know all of what passed in his face, but I'll tell you what I think, for whatever an old man's thinking is worth. I think for 1 second, one only, he saw himself. Saw the small, narrow, cruel shape of what he'd made of his life, reflected back at him off 4 people and 3 dogs who weren't afraid of him, and a woman who just said no like it was the easiest word in the world. I think he saw it, the way you catch yourself sudden in a dark window and don't recognize the man. And I think it was more than he could carry, because he turned, and he went back down the wagon road into the gray, and this time nobody had to draw a line or take a hat off or say a single word. He just went, and the road took him for good. We never saw him again. I made inquiries years later. I'm a man who likes the columns to add up, and I didn't like leaving that one open. He died a few years on, down in a railroad town, of the drink and the cold and his own bad arithmetic. Alone. I won't pretend I grieved it. I won't pretend I celebrated it either. It was just a sum, finally totaled, and the total was a small wasted life that had nearly cost a good woman hers. I wrote the date in my log, and I drew a line under it, and I closed the book on him, which is more dignity than he gave anyone. Spring came. It always does, which is the one thing you can count on and the only thing. The roads cleared. The slush went and the green came up and the cattle dropped their calves, and the town, having lost its wronged husband, slowly got bored of being righteous and went back to extending our credit like nothing had happened, because a town's memory is short and a town's grudge is only ever as deep as its boredom. And Ray's kept his promise, the whole of it, right down to the last hard inch. He let her go. That's the part that takes the wind out of me even now. Because by spring, anybody with eyes could see it. By spring, it wasn't a hired room and a charity case anymore. 3 months will do that. There was a thing between them, quiet and unspoken and careful as everything Ray's did was careful, and I think if he'd asked her to stay, asked for himself this time and not for the ghost of his sister, I think she might have. I think she'd have stayed. And I think Ray's knew it, And I think that's exactly why he never asked. Because he understood the one thing the husband never could in his whole life. He understood that a woman who has just been handed back to herself does not need to be handed straight away to another man, even a good one, even a man she's grown to, whatever she'd grown to. She needed to go be a free person in the world. She needed to find out who she was when she wasn't somebody's wife or somebody's burden or somebody's rescued thing. She needed the spring he'd promised her, the whole spring, the leaving, free and unowned, even by kindness. Especially by kindness. Because kindness can be a cage too, the gentlest cage there is, and Reyes had buried a sister to learn the price of cages, and he was not going to build a soft one now just because his own heart wanted her to stay. So when the roads cleared, he hitched the wagon himself and he gave her the gentlest horse, the one she'd nearly stolen at 4 in the morning in December, gave it to her outright, papers and all. And he gave her money, not charity money. She'd never have taken charity money. He called it her wages for the winter's work, which was a lie we all let stand because it let her take it with her head up. And he gave her a letter to a family he knew 200 miles off, decent people, who'd take her on and ask no questions and let her be whoever she decided to become. She stood by the wagon the morning she left, the whole green spring of it around her, and she looked at Reyes and she tried to say something. I watched her try, and her mouth opened, and once again, the third time now, no words came. Speechless. The rancher's response had left her speechless that first cold night, and now the rancher's whole self had, the entire shape of what he'd done and what he was now choosing not to do, the staggering free gift of being let go. There weren't words for it. There aren't. I've been trying for 30 years and I haven't found them, and I've got more practice than she did. Reyes took his hat off, same as in the yard, and he said the only thing there was to say, which was the same thing he'd said the first night, only it meant the whole world now instead of the start of one. You'll be all right, he said. And then, because he was who he was, and because a thing too heavy has to be set down somehow, he added, dry as the spring dust, mind that horse. He's lazy and he knows it. And she laughed. Through the tears, that surprised by joy laugh I'd first heard in January over something of Tobe's. She laughed, and she climbed up on the wagon seat, and she took the reins in those hands that knew what they were doing, and she drove down the wagon road that had brought her up to us soaked and half dead in November, and she drove it in green spring sunshine on a horse that was hers, with money that was hers, toward a life that was going to be, finally, entirely hers. I stood with Reyes and we watched the dark, no, not the dark this time. We watched the light take her, the bright spring road taking her up and away. He never spoke of her again, not once. 11 more years I worked that ranch and her name never crossed his lips, and I knew better than to cross it with mine. The boy's room got closed up again. The carved horse went back to gathering dust on the windowsill. The ranch went on, cattle and fence posts and the moon over the land, the way I'd thought I understood it, except that I never thought I understood it the same way again. A letter came, the once, maybe 2 years on. I knew the hand on it. I'd seen her writing on the eggs ledger she kept all winter without being asked. Reyes read it alone on the porch in the evening light. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his breast pocket, and he sat there a long time while the dark came on, and he didn't say a word, and I didn't ask, and the next morning the letter was gone, and he never mentioned it, and neither did I. But I'll tell you what I think was in it. I think there was a child in it. A new one, a free one, born somewhere 200 miles off to a woman who decided who she was going to be. And I think, I don't know, but I think that child had a name. And I think it was a name with a small carved horse in it somewhere, or a gray-headed man, or a winter, or a single word said on a porch in the slush. I think she found a way to put him in it, the way you put a thing in a child that you can't say any other way. I think that's why he read it twice and carried it against his chest and never spoke of it, because some things you can't hold up to the light. You can only carry them in the pocket where the heart is, and let them wear smooth and be glad of the weight. I'm an old man and my hand has quit on me for tonight and the lamp's near out. I've set it down now, all of it, the way I said I would before I'm gone too. There's just the one piece left, the thing I've never told anybody, the reason I